Bridget, welcome. Thank you for wanting to have this, Q&A discussion with me. Tell people, listeners, viewers, kind of give them a preface of who you are, what you're all about, and then we can lead into whatever questions I can help with.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on this show. It's like a really big privilege to be here, so thank you. My background is that I've had about 23, 24 years in law enforcement as a civilian employee. I've done a lot of work with the community. The majority of my career has been kind of a liaison with the community, and then towards the last 6 or 7 years, I went more into social media and working out of the public information office and kind of dealing with current events within the police department and the community. I recently retired and moved to Florida and started a new job with a completely different company. It's a seaplane company. We do seaplane tours and instruction. And I'm finding that many times there's a lot of crossover regardless of the complete diverse differences in the jobs. But there's still a lot of commonality. And so it's nice to be able to say to you, how do I mesh the two? How do I take this experience from one and bring it over to the other?
Awesome. Awesome. And you're right. There is, is there an echo when I talk? No. You're right that there is a crossover. It's just nuanced. So give me more specific kind of questions or incidents or issues that I can help kind of pinpoint and answer.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm still somewhat connected to the department in the sense that they'll call me sometimes and they will ask for my opinion on things. And recently, there was a situation where I found it kind of interesting because I think a lot of law enforcement agencies will probably deal with the same thing. So you have a situation on social media where, in this case, it was a baseball game in memory of a fallen officer.
Okay.
And when all the team members, aka police officers, got together, they took a team photo. One of the officers did this little okay sign with his fingers in the picture. My interpretation, being really close still to the department, would be, yay, look at us, we're doing really well. This is for you, Carrie, the fallen officer. And yet it didn't go over well with a small segment of the population. They felt it was racist. They demanded that he be fired. And it really went to a lot of different avenues that I don't think it didn't rise to that relevancy in my mind. And so, but it did to the public. So they had the media calling, asking for a statement from the department. How does the department feel about this officer? What kind of training does this officer have? And that sort of stuff. So my question to you on something like that is, social media goes across the board with everybody. There's no difference with anybody. Everybody has the same access to social media, and all the people are different. So you have this small, almost a subsection of the population that takes offense at something that a police department does. My question is it a crisis when it's a small subsection? Is it something that you respond to, that small group? Do you wait until it gets bigger? I know it's like a million questions for you, but
no.
It was just, how would you recommend that departments handle something that really isn't a crisis, but yet it's got that underlying of a very loud subculture of people?
Great question. And it's not just, so to your initial point, when you were just kind of introducing yourself, you said that you see that there's a lot of crossover. So let's make this real for everybody listening, law enforcement and the private sector as well. So, and also for those who are listening and not watching, what the officer did was like an okay sign, right? Where you put connect your finger and your index, or your index and your thumb together, and you have your last 3 fingers up. I'm trying to paint a picture for those listening and can't see us. So that was the signal that they did. To answer your question, it always goes to getting to the root cause, right? So personally, so what is it that they saw was racist about this?
That symbol has been used by other groups to represent racist issues.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so they were drawing an association with or a connection to that. Um, I say this often, and it's my friend Dave Carroll's words. Nobody is statistically insignificant, so it's important to have that mindset and to look at incidents through that lens. So even if it's a small segment of your audience or your stakeholder groups, that's significant, right? It may not escalate to crisis, but with every issue, we have an opportunity to connect the brand on an emotional level closer to stakeholders and continue to build trust and credibility. It's an opportunity to do those if we issue manage correctly. The other part of it is that the more goodwill you bank in advance, the more opportunity you will have to have a community that comes to your defense. So sometimes when you don't necessarily know how to respond or don't want to necessarily respond because you're worried that it might increase, right? It might escalate the situation, because sometimes that's the case, especially when it's controversial. Having that bank of advocacy built up, your community can come in for you and say, I personally know this officer. I know 100% that our law enforcement agency is not racist. And here is our perspective. So you can have that dialogue, which gives you an opportunity in these types of cases to kind of just sit back, monitor, and listen, and then take it from there. However, so all of that said, it is also important when evaluating any type of situation like this to look at the root cause. So to understand the why. Why was this seen as racist? What does that mean? What is the emotional connection there? And what's the risk and impact of all of that on the brand or on the agency, in connection with that stakeholder group and the organization, right? That emotional connection. And how can you address it in a way that validates their emotions and corrects any misconceptions in an emotionally intelligent way? And thirdly, continues to strengthen and build that tie as a relationship with those people, with those stakeholders. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think in my experience that, law enforcement, or again, it crosses over any department, any agencies, businesses. You wonder if you're going to fuel that fire, and you wonder if you don't do something if you're going to fuel the fire. And I think it's kind of a catch-22. And I think there is an opportunity for a chance to have a dialogue and an open communication and to build relationships. But there is that small segment, and I know you say everybody counts, but there is that small segment that is looking for a reason.
Yes. Yeah, there is. And for law enforcement in particular, so that's where having advocacy, having a community that comes to, I'm going to say, to your defense, helps in those situations, because then you don't necessarily need to do anything. Your community kind of has this dialogue together, and you monitor and then know when that threshold is going to be passed and know what you're going to do if that happens. For law enforcement in particular, right now and over the last few years, there is a crisis within that profession. There's a gap right now between law enforcement community agency and communities for a large part of North America. Not every agency, not every community, but as a whole, this is something that law enforcement is facing. So if we look at the bigger picture and we say that a lot of that stems from the issue of racial discrimination and just all of the impacts of that and the realities around that, if we look at that as a bigger picture, then we have to say, what in this situation, how can we view this as an opportunity to help our community start to bridge that gap or strengthen those ties to mitigate. The ultimate goal is that you want the community to know that the agency does not discriminate, right? And is very all-encompassing and there to protect and serve the entire community and cares about those relationships and those connections within the community. So if that's the ultimate goal, then it's just about finding the right path and strategy of execution to take the steps in the right direction to achieve that goal. And this is an opportunity to do that if we want to look at it through that lens. Now, you're right that you're never going to appeal to everybody or please everybody. And again, that's when the advocacy comes in. And two, you have to know that and know where that threshold lies of making a response or putting out a response, the right response, a very emotionally intelligent response, and in line with the values of the organization response, clear and concise, and then stop talking.
Yeah, I like that, stop talking. And then either let your stakeholders, not your stakeholders, but your supportive people, your community, let them run with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's what we see is, you'll make a statement, but that statement is either seems to be, I think what agencies are faced with many times is the statement is either going to please the public or please the department, the officers. And sometimes it's a difficult line to walk because you can't make everybody happy.
You can't, but it doesn't have to be either or. And that mentality of it's either going to please the community or the department, that is the mentality that we're trying to bridge, right? That we're trying to escape from. It's us versus them. It's not. It's community. That needs to be the goal. So in this particular case, I don't see any reason why it needed to be either or. But it needed to be addressed correctly.
Well, I think the message that you give for departments and find what the goal is a really good message, because for years it's been either or. And I think it's getting better, but I think there are still a lot of departments as well as businesses that haven't banked that goodwill yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't have a lot of goodwill, how do you not dig yourself in deeper when something like that happens?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Build the goodwill. Like seriously, it gives so much opportunity, and that's not just for law enforcement. That's for every business. Is about people, and crisis management is about people. So any strong, successful business looks at the relationships that they have with their stakeholders, focusing on those relationships every day. Is how you get that goodwill, right? And then that gives you the benefit of the doubt in the event of a crisis. It gives you advocacy the way that we're talking about it. It gives you an understanding of who you're speaking to and with and what they expect of you and how to meet those expectations because you do it every day. It's cultural, it's instinctive at that point. So there's no excuse to not build that goodwill. That needs to be a proactive strategy, an everyday, slowly and surely strategy that's executed on day in and day out.
Are you seeing that happening more often with departments?
I am. I
Good.
think I'm seeing the crisis begin to manage not itself, because it takes time and will. I'm also surrounded by incredible agencies that get it. And those agencies, in combination with any opportunity that I have to connect them with other agencies, like there's this network that exists and that is being proactively expanded upon and within, and that's a beautiful thing. And I got a note a couple weeks ago from a police chief that said, I'm reading your book for the second time. Once was to go through, second was to implement. Can we have a conversation? I have some questions. It was like, absolutely, yes, we can. And who can I connect you with that will help answer your questions because they're directly in the field? And then connecting them with those captains and those chiefs of police and, building out that. So yes, I see it starting to begin to become managed, and in a beautiful, beautiful way.
Well, departments still have, and this again is going back to law enforcement for the moment, but when you have a critical incident with law enforcement and you can only release certain information, is there is there any type of process that you would recommend? Because you don't have the facts, and police departments aren't going to put out information without the facts.
Nope.
But yet, many times the general public doesn't understand that, and they're kind of not buying it. It goes back to that no comment, which is, nobody should be doing that.
No.
But is there a process for departments, something they should be saying, doing when a critical incident happens and they can't get the information that the public wants right now?
Absolutely. And that's not just particular to law enforcement. That is particular to scenario-specific incidents and across every single industry. So there's this need right now, or this demand for transparency and real-time communication. There is the reality that the longer you take to communicate effectively, let's underscore that term effectively, in a crisis or in a viral issue, the more control over the narrative you risk losing, the more trust and credibility you risk losing, and the more crisis response penalty, CRP, you risk suffering. So and yet, you don't necessarily have all of the information, nor can you always be in a position to communicate all of the information that maybe you do have. And so it's not just particular to law enforcement. This applies to everybody listening, depending on this, the high-risk scenario that they might be faced with. Banking up, like having those relationships where there's trust set, so it goes to our previous, what we just talked about, is banking up that goodwill in advance so that your stakeholders know they can trust you, that they feel that they can trust you. That goes a long way in helping you in those situations. The other part is knowing that today you need to give more than we did in the past. So in the past, you might be able to say, we're in the process of conducting an investigation. We can't talk. We'll be back when we can. Today, in order to really communicate through action and through your words that you are committed to transparency, you can give more than just we're in the middle of an investigation or we're in the midst of an investigation. You can give more details around the investigation. You can give more details around expectation of timeline of that investigation. You can give details around your commitment to keeping the public, your stakeholders, informed with any information as it gets confirmed and as you're able to communicate it. You can give communication around anticipated questions, right? So maybe there's specific details that you don't know, haven't confirmed, or can't release yet, but there are more questions that you probably can address that are on the tops of each different stakeholder group's minds, that in addressing and answering those questions in a transparent and emotionally intelligent way, that you will demonstrate through action that they can count on you for when the rest of the information that you can't communicate right away is available, and when you can. And then just so it's in actions and it's in communication, and there's no excuse today for no comment. No comment is a massive comment that you don't want to communicate. And there's ways around that. People expect information, they expect transparency, they expect commitment to transparency and to constant communication, but they know that you don't have all of the information. They can understand that if you communicate it effectively and if you demonstrate that your commitment to that transparency as you can.
Well, I'm a year and a half into the private sector, service industry, and I can clearly see how everything, as you were speaking, I was listening and thinking, well, how do I apply all that to the business that I'm in now? And there's no difference at all. There's no difference at all.
There is no difference.
No, and there may be some legal issues, like you say, maybe sometimes you can say something, sometimes you can't. But thankfully, in the industry that I'm in now, we haven't suffered anything where I've needed my Melissa help. But I can clearly see where the steps, and I have your little diagram from your book. I have that in my briefcase all the time, just so that if something happens, instead of that first panic mode, I know that the first thing I do is go look at that piece of paper, take a breath, the schematics, and see, does it rise to this level? Is this going on? No. Okay, is this going on? Yes. And then I can figure out where I'm going to go to, and it almost buys you, I don't want to say peace of mind, because it's kind of hard to get peace of mind, but maybe a little bit of clarity at the moment when you're in the thick of things. And so, yeah, I can definitely see where it's no different.
So thank you for that. And for listeners and viewers, the document that you're talking about is my crisis ready flow chart. So for issue management. Another one that hits on what we're talking about is I have a crisis ready formula for managing controversies. I will link to both of these below this video and podcast so that people have access to it. But that gives those clear 4 steps on when managing a controversy, because controversy segregates no matter what, and you cannot, it polarizes, and you cannot appeal to both sides in controversy. So how do you manage that effectively? Which goes to a little bit of what we're talking about, and I have a recipe for that, or a formula, I should say, for that. But to add to your point of crisis, it's about people, right? So the expectations are pretty consistent across the board, as are the real world, real-time challenges, no matter what your industry is. So this is why the deep dive approach is so essential, which I talk about in my book. So understanding the difference between issue and crisis, defining that for your organization, and clearly defining those thresholds as to from when an issue would escalate to crisis, what that looks like, what to look for, and so that your team is very instinctively able to respond appropriately. And then looking at what are the most likely high impact scenarios that you're the most prone and vulnerable to in both the issue and the crisis categories, and doing a deep dive into each one of those. Because while it's, to your point, it's applicable whether you're on, the public sector or the private sector, no matter your industry, the nuances lie within those scenarios. And that's why taking that deep dive approach into each one of those scenarios and being crisis ready in terms of actions and communications for the most likely high impact scenarios that you're vulnerable to is so essential, and arms you with so much knowledge and advantage, first for mitigating and preventing, and second in response if it were to materialize.
Well, when I first started this new job, I didn't have your book yet. And
it wasn't out yet, I don't think.
It wasn't out yet. and I really struggled with the crossover because, I'm coming from one completely different type of business and to another. And yeah, I had a little bit of trouble with it. And then I got the book, and then I read the flow chart. Now I remember what it's called, flow chart. And it made so much sense. And I feel that I'm so much more prepared now in the event something happens, because before, I had multiple layers of stakeholders of who you'd have to, inform, the city government, the city mayor, all of that. You'd have to keep everybody abreast. Here I'm in a private mom and pop operation, but there's still multiple people that you need to let know and advise, depending on what the situation might be. And so I feel much more prepared. And the interesting thing is I felt prepared in my last job. And now that I recognize that it crosses over, I don't feel like I have to start over. I feel like I'm right where I was because all of the information is still the same.
That's
it's just
awesome.
situationally different.
That's awesome. I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you. And your company is lucky to have you.
Oh, thank you. So is yours. Oh, wait, you are the company. Yeah, well, I don't know what I'd do without you, and I recommend you to everybody because I know what it feels like not to be prepared before the pre-Melissa. I know what it feels like. I mean, our very first major controversy, we were caught totally unprepared. We didn't even know it was going on social media because it happened overnight. And we woke up to it felt like everybody in the world criticizing the police department. And I felt like I was chasing my tail at that time. And had I had that information, it's never fun to go through that, but it is so much better when you go through and you feel like you're anchored and that, you're going to get through it. You just have to take the steps now. The steps to go through it, and what is a crisis, what is not a crisis. You can monitor its advancement. And oh my gosh, it's just so much easier to get through. So thank you.
Thank you for saying that, and thank you for doing the work in service of both the law enforcement agency and in your new organization or your new position. Is there anything else that I can help with?
I was trying to think, I think you've pretty much answered it, because I was thinking about, stakeholders. Who do you bring to the table? Do you bring, when it's an issue versus the crisis, just knowing who to bring to the table, because it's like, I don't want to bother somebody, especially if it's not going to go anywhere.
Yep.
But until it goes somewhere that you don't need to know. So I think sometimes it's hard for people to understand when they aren't in the thick of things. Who do I notify on an issue versus a crisis?
Okay, that's an important question. So this goes to governance, right? Creating your governance structure, and your governance structure for crisis management needs to be two things. It needs to mirror the governance structure of the organization, because everything about your crisis readiness needs to be practical and not, oh, we do this differently in times of crisis, because in crisis we revert to default. So doing differently in times of crisis serves nobody. And the second thing is that it needs to be scalable from the minor issues straight through to the catastrophic crises. And in doing that, so for example, in a crisis, you're going to need senior leadership, right? You need their directive, their decision making, their minds, all of that. You also need to have every single one of your stakeholder groups represented at that table, so that nobody is overlooked or forgotten, or just anything like that. And for example, one that I see happen often is HR is not represented at that table. Therefore, employees are not represented at that table. That's a common mistake, and creates a crisis within a crisis, or an issue within a crisis internally. So that's kind of in the crisis. And then any external or internal subject matter experts, depending on the scenario and its impact. So that's kind of very high level overview of catastrophic crisis on that end of the scale, your governance structure, and the flow of command and all of that needs to mirror the current governance structure of the organization. Now, scale that back to issue management is, I like to refer to it as business as usual on hyperdrive. So you're not going to need senior leadership, nor are you going to need every stakeholder represented. You're going to need the people who are responsible for managing that issue or that scope and impact on a regular basis. Their job is going to be on hyperdrive that day, right? However, the transition between the two, I'm trying to paint this as a scenario. The transition between the two is your assessment groups, and these are scenario specific. So let's use an example. Let's use IT as an example, cybersecurity incident. Your IT department detects something, or somebody else detects something and sends it to the IT department. They do an initial analysis and they look and they say, oh, this is a little bit more than the regular types of issues that we deal with day to day, because IT typically deals with issues every single day. And we're not quite sure, because they're trained experts in what they do. They're not trained experts in understanding full scope and impact, or even assessing full scope and impact on every other potential impact that it can have on the business, on stakeholders, on reputation, and all of these other dynamics. So that assessment group is for when there is an issue that either that group, that department, let's say, doesn't fully feel prepared to handle it alone, or if they think that there's risk or potential for it to escalate, then you have an assessment group that is defined, that is, who do you bring in to properly assess the full scope and impact of the situation, and determine what the correct response is, or approach to response is. So actions and communications, whether it's, we're going to handle this together and here's what we're going to do, or this needs to be escalated now to more people within our governance and leadership and all of that. Does that answer your question, or can I go deeper into something to really give you more?
Well, something that you said really resonated me when you said going back to default. And I thought, whoa, you know what? That's hugely important, because pre-social media, which it seems like, that was 100 years ago, but it wasn't. And so a lot of people still aren't up to speed on social media and media. And default could mean what we did before. And like any memory muscle, you fall back on default.
Absolutely.
And so I thought, wow, people need to take a look at what they would normally do, throw something at them. How would you normally handle this? Because it's so easy to go back to what you've always done.
Yes.
And that's not working in today's time. And so I think if I could express one thing to companies is to look at what their default is, and maybe even go through the whole process of how we used to do it, and then look at the new way of doing business that you have to be doing. I don't think you have a choice. I think if you don't step up to your type of crisis readiness, that you're just shooting yourself in the foot.
Yes.
And shooting yourself in the foot can mean the end of your business. And so, yeah, that just really resonated with me when you said that.
It can mean the end of your business. It can mean, depending on the situation, it can mean major dire impact on people, whether that's physically, right, putting them in harm's way, or just not being able to help them when something happens like that, or whether it's their data, whatever the case is. I'll say this, that yes, you're absolutely right. And that's why, so my crisis ready model has those 5 stages that is really my framework that I use to help organizations become crisis ready. And in those stages, the first one is audit mindset and culture. And that's where you're looking at what your default is, what your current culture is, and where do you currently sit? What's the mindset within your organization? How are issues managed? Are they seen as opportunities versus new, negative type of grievances? So basically, where does your organization sit on that spectrum of crisis readiness? The second phase is the education phase. And the education phase, the second phase, and the fifth phase is the implementation phase. The reason I'm saying this is that the education phase is designed to put everybody within that governance structure to bring them to an equal level playing field, a baseline of information, knowledge, education on what is required today. What can we expect today, like it or not? What are, the different impacts and nuances and all of these things. So giving them that education so that everybody at least starts to be on the same wavelength. And then the implement phase is where you really start to create the new defaults. So you take the in between there is collecting data, so the identify phase, and then the designing of the program phase. So when you get to the implement phase, and I'm doing this because it's the tip of the model, right, which is the triangle. So for listeners, I'm making this triangle with my fingers as I talk about it. And the implement phase is really to do that. It's to hone skills. It's to work team build and build these relationships and these connections and this trust amongst the team that is responsible for managing issues and crises, and to also test the program and strengthen process and all of these things. So you want to create, I'm going to constantly say it, I constantly do say it, is that crisis management is not a plan that sits on a shelf. Being crisis ready needs to be cultural so that you mitigate the most amount of crises, and that responding to crisis or viral issue is instinctive and done right in real time as a team collaboration across the organization. So the model is designed to help you redo your default if it needs to be redone, and to help the team really hone their skills.
Well, I think we have honed our skills thanks to you. I feel like we are well prepared if we need to be. Hopefully, again, we won't need to be. But I feel, based on the last 24 years of my career and learning it then and getting educated by you, I feel like I think we've got a really good start, as long as I don't lose your flow chart in my briefcase.
And my
I need to
number.
blow it up, make a poster of it. But yeah, I don't want to do that either. I don't want it on the wall. I don't want people thinking crisis. But I want us to always have that in the back of our mind, because I do want the default to be the correct way.
Well, you're on the right path, and thank you so much for the honor, and just keep up the amazing work. I really mean it when I say your company is so lucky to have you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time to work with me.
Oh, of course, my pleasure. Do you want to share any insight or links or things for people to kind of learn more, or do you want to keep this just as a Q? So Q&As are a little bit different. So I want to respect your privacy to the extent that you want it respected, but also give you an opportunity to share if you'd like to share.
There's really nothing unless people are coming to Florida, and they can go to the only seaplane company in Tavares, Florida. I don't know if I can say our name. Can I say our name?
That's totally your call. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, Jones Brothers Seaplanes is a really fun place to be. It's completely different from law enforcement. We get to fly around and look at the beautiful area and see gators and all the wildlife. And so, but it's a very, very high risk business.
Yes,
You
it is.
know, and yeah, for a high risk business and a high enjoyable business, we just need to be ready for anything. And you know, you never know what's going to happen, but I definitely think that we are well on our way to being able to handle something if anything did happen.
Well, knock on wood that it never does. And for listeners and viewers, I have had the pleasure and joy of getting to experience the Jones Brothers Seaplane. That's right, Jones Brothers. That's what I usually
Seaplane
call it,
adventures.
Seaplanes
Yes.
Adventures. There you go, into Tavares, Florida. And it is so worth the trip. And the team is amazing. And you really do have the right culture. You have the right mindset. And you work every day to become and to strengthen your crisis readiness. So
Mm-hmm.
I applaud you all. And it's a
Thank
pleasure
you.
working with you when I get the opportunity to.
Thank you very much. I feel the same.
Thank you, Bridget.
Take care.